I wouldn't bother. That's great. Oh, there you go. If you have no speaking,
nice to know there's somebody that's even in that.
Oh, okay. Hey, friends! Yo! Here's what's up! In case you're interested, what we're doing is we have to wait till the city turns on the power. They say they're going to do it right away. I have no idea what right away means, probably in the next few minutes, but we're hesitating to start until we have power.
We have the power.
Yeah, well, there's that. But, so, if you have trouble hearing, come on closer, and we promise we won't spit on you. If you can hear us just fine, then stay where you are, right? So we'll start once we get power. We've got speakers from the Sister City program, proclamations, people who have seen occupation, and more coming up for you. Just hang in there. When the power's on, we'll start.
Thank you. I don't know yet, sorry. Yeah. I still don't have the masks.
Right here. There you are. Come on up. So get closer so you can hear. And anywhere you want to stand. Reverend Lindsay Kerr.
Okay, if you can hear me, put your hand up.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me? I'm going to say that one more time. If you can hear me, put your hand up. Okay. If you can't hear me, this is the greatest speech you will ever hear.
ever here.
My name's Lindsay. It's a joy to be with you here because it's good always and everywhere when people gather together and stand up for justice and peace. That's why we're here today. That's why you've come out. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for taking the step from getting off of your couch to getting into the streets to actually declare that justice is important and justice holds sway in this world.
Yes.
I want us to take a moment and reflect on what we just heard from Rebel. The land that we're standing on is illegitimately taken by an empire that sought to overrun nations of people who, you know, were not able to defend against weapons of mass destruction. Does that sound like anyone else we know? Sure does. We come here longing for justice and peace in Ukraine, and also we should be troubled inside of our own hearts. We should be troubled inside of our own hearts because we cannot call out the imperialism of another nation without acknowledging the imperialism that the United States propagates every day. We cannot lift up and celebrate the resistance of Ukrainian people without lifting up and celebrating the people within the United States, people of color within the United States who are resisting the oppression by police forces. We cannot lift up the rights of Ukrainian people to defend themselves without also lifting up the ongoing battle by indigenous people in places like Palestine, in places like the southern Philippines, against imperial powers that are trying to take their land. All right. Holding all of that together, we can also be really pissed about what's going on in Ukraine. And I want us to take a moment and not give in to self-righteous anger, but rather stay clear in righteousness. I want us to not give in to the sense of entitlement that we might have to tell other people how to do things in their country, and also realize that we need to show up for this conversation. We need to show up and stand in solidarity with Ukrainian people, with ethnic Ukrainian people, but also refugees who happen to be in Ukraine and who are being blocked at the Polish border from leaving Ukraine. We need to stand up for queer people who are now really scared to be entering into Poland. We need to stand up with and for the people who are staying to fight. And we also need to acknowledge that for some people, they will refuse to bear arms, and that is their right as a human being. Holding all of this, I want us to take a moment and become fully present here. I want you to become attuned with the anger that you hold in your heart. And I want you also to remember that that same anger, that same desire for justice is being held in the heart of every other person here. Let's remember that we are not alone in raising our voices for Ukraine. There are people around this nation and people around this world who are showing up to speak out against this egregious injustice. So I want to invite you, whatever your faith tradition, whatever your background, whatever your belief, to remember that we are held by this common spirit, by this common desire to reach for justice, and that the solidarity that we share together is what is going to make this movement for peace strong. Amen. So it is. Thank you for being here.
Going to have something I think you'll enjoy. We have a speaker coming up from the City Council to talk about solidarity and commitment, John Sawyer. Before he starts, he's not responsible for power outage. Don't throw things at him.
Well, actually, maybe I am just a little. Maybe you are. Yeah, so thank you, Lindsay, for your moving words. It touched every one of us. And let's hear it one more time for Lindsay. Let them hear it in Ukraine. So this proclamation was read last Tuesday, and a signed copy, or signed original actually, being sent to the mayor, both mayors, our sister city in Cherkasy and in Kyiv. Whereas, there are a number of whereases here, so I'll just apologize for that in advance. It's still quite meaningful. Whereas the city of Santa Rosa has been a sister city with the city of Cherkasy, Ukraine since 1990. And whereas the cities of Santa Rosa and Cherkasy have developed deep and meaningful bonds of friendship and cultural exchanges of people of all ages, Santa Rosa and Cherkasy residents staying in each other's homes and sharing each other's lives. And whereas American-Ukrainian relations have long served as an example and a foundation for security, freedom, the development of democracy and human rights in Eastern Europe and across the globe. And whereas Ukraine and the Ukrainian people represent a distinct culture with a long, proud history. And whereas self-determination is the inalienable right of all people around the world, including the Ukrainian people, and whereas a free and independent Ukraine is of vital importance to protecting the Ukrainian people, their history, culture, literature, music, traditions, language, and art, and whereas the country of Ukraine is facing unprovoked, unrestrained, and unconscionable military aggression from the Russian Federation. And whereas the Ukrainian people, their leadership and their president have shown the world what it is to lead from the front, the spirit, resolve, strength, fierce defiance, and patriotism of the Ukrainian people are to be celebrated. And whereas the city of Santa Rosa recognizes the horrors and the humiliation crisis that has brought this war has brought upon the Ukrainian people, including those in the city of Cherkasy. Now therefore be resolved that Chris Rogers, Mayor of the City of Santa Rosa, on behalf of the entire City Council and you, to hereby condemn the violation of Ukraine's sovereign nation borders, independence, and territorial integrity, and oppose the unnecessary and tragic loss of life this unprovoked armed conflict has caused, and affirm our support for our sister city Cherkasy, Ukraine, and the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, signed by Mayor Chris Rogers on March 1st. Thank you.
two or three speakers coming up dealing with the commonality of this issue. Starting first with Therese McGanum with a focus here on peace. Go ahead, Therese.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello. I have kids and grandkids, so I can yell. Thank you all for being here and for showing your concern for and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. We are here, as Lindsay said, Reverend Lindsay said, because we truly believe that war is never the answer between nations or peoples in dispute. Like you, I have seen the pictures in the media showing devastated families, crying mothers, trying to shield and comfort their children, whose confused little faces are full of questions. Old men and women trying to keep up, dragging suitcases behind. As I said, I'm a mother and a grandmother, and I can hardly imagine the anguish and pain of those Ukrainian women I've seen in the news, leaving behind their men and their country, both of which they may never see again. How tragic. Hard to believe our eyes when we see the effects of the bombs dropped in civilian neighborhoods, devastating the neighborhoods where children used to play. Can you imagine that happening here?
Yes.
Okay.
Just sit around and wait for it.
That's why we are here, because we're not going to let that happen anymore. Have we learned anything from the wars of the last century, or even from conflicts of the last 2 decades all over the world, which have displaced so many innocents from their homes, most notable in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and so many other places? Pardon me? That's coming up. I am Palestinian by birth, and months after I was born, my family had to flee the war and massacres, which displaced us and countless people. Others they displaced us, and we had to go to the neighboring country, never to return to our beloved Palestine. So much cruelty and injustice in this world, which often fuel more hatred, bitterness, and conflict. We've got to stop that. Yet, I am learning to resist the temptation to be carried away by the prevailing narrative about what is happening in Ukraine and Russia and why it's happening. I am a grateful American. Well, most of the time. Deeply grateful for opportunities this country has given me and my family. But I am beyond trusting what comes out of the mouths of U.S. spokespersons, both White House and Pentagon, or our allies, and our sensationalist media. Let me tell you how I view what is happening today in this current conflict. But before I do, I want to be sure you hear me when I say that I ethically and morally object, deeply, strongly object to what Vladimir Putin has done, is doing as we speak here, as we stand here in Ukraine. And you may disagree with me, although I think so many familiar faces, I think you'll probably agree with me. You may disagree with me, but as I see it, NATO and the U.S. must carry their share of responsibility. Yes! In an article by Norman Solomon, I'm sure you've heard his name, I recently came across, he quotes historian David Gibbs, who says, "It is worth recalling how much the NATO alliance has weakened world security since the end of the Cold War by inflaming relations with Russia. It is often forgotten that the cause of the current conflict arose from a 1990 U.S. promise that NATO would never be expanded into the former communist states of Eastern Europe. Not 1 inch to the east, Russian leaders were promised by the U.S. Secretary of State James Baker at the time. I'm old enough to remember that, and I think that many of you probably do too. But despite this promise, NATO soon expanded into Eastern Europe and eventually placing the alliance up against Russia's borders. The present-day U.S.-Russian conflict is the direct result of this expansion." End quote. I'm no fan of Putin, but it seems sensible to me as a human being to have pressed for diplomacy and negotiations immediately. I'm neither a historian nor a politician, but I do know some things. I'm old enough to know some things. It is not, is it not ultimate arrogance as we continue to see pictures of unnecessary death and devastation? Very dangerous to continue to operate from the throne of do as I say, but not as I do. Is that not ultimate arrogance? What about following the golden rule? Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. I know I'm an idealist, as so many of us here are, but don't you agree that honest listening and negotiating is better than all the arms shipments that West is sending to Ukraine, which inevitably will fall into the hands of the wrong people, as has happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other places. Here's a professor from San Francisco State University who says, his name is Saigankov, Andrei Saigankov, professor of international relations. He says, and he said this before the bombing began, whatever plans Russia may have with respect to Ukraine and NATO, conflict resolution greatly depend on the West. A major war is avoidable if Western leaders gather confidence and the will to abandon the counterproductive language of threats and engage Russia in reasoned dialogue. If diplomacy is given a fair chance, the European continent may arrive at a new security system that will reflect, among others, Russia's interest and participation. End quote. That seems reasonable to me. You can't threaten a bully. Try as best you can. I don't think that has happened. I have another issue, painful comparison with the way the West and the U.S. are responding to this war. And I preface what I want to say with my agreement with all the sanctions placed on Putin and the oligarchs. But also, sadly, on the people of Russia, some of whom are protesting this war and are paying the price for it. Of course, I too want this war to stop now. I pray every day, and I'm not just saying that, I pray every day that the needless suffering and death would end now. Being a Palestinian American engaged in helping to bring justice to the conflict in Palestine, Israel, I wonder about the double standard the U.S. and the West in general most often employ. Why was the world largely silent when Israeli airplanes were dropping U.S.-made bombs on civilians in Gaza last year? Or, again, U.S.-made bombs on the people of Yemen. Still happening. Why? Why aren't we rising up against that? Could it be, but could it be because the Gazans and the Yemenis do not have blue eyes and blonde hair? Yes! Like the Ukrainians do? Think about it. We have to face it. I read some days ago that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has already sent representatives to Ukraine to collect evidence of war crimes committed by the Russian military, which I applaud. But why is it that the same ICC court still hasn't done anything about the war crimes committed by the apartheid government of Israel against its indigenous occupied Palestinian population?
Yeah, right.
I have a right to ask that. We all do.
Yes.
This even after 3 major human rights organizations have done extensive research and have publicly announced that Israel is an apartheid state.
Oh, yeah.
3 prominent human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli human rights organization Beit Tselem. I'm almost done. I believe it's time. It's time that we end the deadly game of racism. It's time that we open our hearts and our doors to all human beings fleeing for their lives, fleeing for a safer and better life for themselves and their children, whether they are Ukrainian or Haitians or Mexicans. All humanity. Just like my family fled 1948 Palestine. It's also time that we listen to the concerns and fears of other peoples and other nations. That we stop demonizing them for not bowing down to us. Us, the remarkable and at the same time often arrogant and cruel empire we have become. You may not agree with me on that, but just look around what we're doing in the world. We need to stop the meddling in other nations' affairs and then building walls, psychological or real, to protect ourselves when they try to escape the destruction of their communities caused by our corporate greed and power. Let's instead all work earnestly and commit ourselves to do what is necessary to bring about justice and peace to all living beings on our planet. No exception! Thank you.
One of my personal concerns about this conflict is the American tendency to villainize a whole group of people. Y'all remember maybe the forced deportation of Syrian Americans, many of whom were not Syrian, or the more recent, what was it, Kung Flu thing? And then all of a sudden these Asian Americans are getting beat up, the Sikhs are getting beat up because people don't know what a Sikh is. We have to also, in our rush to peace, not demonize our fellows who live in our same neighborhood. There's a really cool Russian restaurant out on the coast. I'd hate like hell for that thing to get burned, you know? So keep that in mind. And to speak briefly about Russia, we have Linda Sator, who's, yes, that's right, and then we have Fred coming up to talk about the Sister City thing. Again, if you're having trouble hearing, get closer, and it's okay for speakers to cup their hands and do this thing, turn her back and forth. It'll help project. Thank you for your patience.
So I was asked to speak today because I went to Russia on a citizen diplomacy tour in 2017, 5 years ago. When I came back from that tour, I had expected I would do some presentations about what I learned from being there. But I came back and I realized that what my perspective was from having been there and experienced the people and their perspective, and coming back to the U.S., where propaganda has really, really demonized not only Putin, but Russia because of Putin. And it was so different. It's such a completely different perception than I had from my experience with Russian people and in Russia. I couldn't figure out where to talk, how to talk to people who were believing that what we were hearing in the U.S. was true. And Therese mentioned the part about NATO. I want to give a little bit more about what my understanding of the relationship between NATO and Russia has been since the Cold War, the original Cold War ended, which I think has never really ended because the U.S. continues to perpetuate Russia as an enemy for its own reasons. But NATO, besides the fact that saying it would never expand east, has expanded through 12 different countries and come to the borders of Russia, putting Putin like it's an existential threat to Putin and Russia. In 2014 was sort of a beginning of where we are now in some ways. There was a U.S. coup that replaced the Ukrainian leadership with somebody who was totally anti the Russian regime. And that was right around the time when Crimea was supposedly illegally annexed by Russia. From the Russian perspective, there was a vote. There was a democratic vote. 90% of the population showed up to vote. How many people show up in our elections? That's amazing. 90% of the population of Crimea showed up to vote, and over 90% of them voted for rejoining Russia. But we call it an illegal annexation. In the Donbas region, there's a large minority of Russian-speaking population. Right at that time when this coup took place, the Ukraine made Ukrainian the national language, and it legalized other 3 languages that were being spoken there, or 4 languages: Russian, Hungarian, Moldavian, and Romanian. So in the Donbas region, where there's this higher minority of Russian speakers, between 2014 and 2021, since 2014 until this last year, there's been 14,000 deaths and 50,000 casualties due to conflict in that region. The Russian people of that region asked Russia for support. And now fast forward to, well, not fast forward, I left you at 2021. In December of 2021, Putin proposed a mutual security treaty between Russia and NATO with 9 articles to negotiate, and one of them was to stay out of the Ukraine, for NATO to stay out of the Ukraine. What I say is, well, 2 things I want to say. One thing is, psychologically I know when there's something about me that I'm not liking, it might not have been okay. It's easy for me to put it out on somebody else like it's their fault. But that's not where the power is. I have to look within to where I do have power. That's one thing good about paying attention to how the U.S. has treated Putin as a demon. I wish, I hope, I invite you to get a hold of one, even just one speech, one time when Putin said anything, and listen to him, not through our media, but through YouTube. Because everything he says, I'm amazed. I'm much more in favor of what Putin says than I am of many of what our leaders say. So please, don't let our media completely demonize a place where there is hope for the future. Thank you.
The people who most oppose war are the people who fight it, because they've seen it. Our next speaker is from Veterans of Peace 71, a world mountain climber and instrumental in our Sister City program, Fred Kazucha.
Okay, I want to go back a bit. In 1964, I was a Navy midshipman, and I had to get permissive travel orders from our government to go into Russia, then the Soviet Union. And I had a week in the dorm at the University of Moscow with Grisha, my roommate. And that was shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at the end of that week, Grisha and I pricked our fingers and became blood brothers. We made a vow to each other that when we got into our 40s and positions of responsibility, we would try to make the world safer from the nuclear war that almost happened. Well, I didn't do much wrong, and at the end of having 4 tours as a naval officer in Vietnam, and a dark time in my life. Then, all of a sudden, I got recruited by a guy named John Masura, who created a sister city in Cherkasy, Ukraine. So, maybe I'm not there to work well. I'm just going to speak. You gotta yell. Okay, so we started. I led the first citizens delegation from Sonoma County, Santa Rosa to Cherkasy in 1989, and we've talked about generalities a bit. I want to give you some specifics of how this tragedy is affecting me. I have a cousin, Lydia, who wanted to stay and fight Cherkasy, but she's a single mom with a 6-year-old son. She fled and a couple of days ago reached Berlin, Germany. Her older brother was faced with a difficult choice. He had a wife and 2 children. He was going to protect them, but he couldn't leave because that's their thing. If you're between 18 and 60 and a male in Ukraine, you cannot leave the country. But they fled and are staying in, I think, a country village in the Carpathian Mountains in the far west of Ukraine. But he had to make that choice. Is he going to stay and fight for his country, or is he going to look after his wife and 2 children? Who would want to be put in that terrible position? Another friend, Luda Melnick, she is my counterpart on the Climbers for Peace expeditions that we've been doing around the world for over 20 years. She is a 60-year-old woman, solo, living in Kyiv, and she can hear the bombs and the missiles going out her flat in Kyiv. But she has a Kalashnikov, and I don't know how many people here are 60-year-olds who want to go out and face the Soviet army with a weapon, but that's the spirit of the Ukrainian people. So the ongoing tragedy of this war is very personal. I have many, many friends in Cherkasy and throughout, and actually have friends in Russia on this. So one thing I'll add with people is do not demonize the Russian people. They don't want to be fighting there any more than my generation wanted to go and fight in Vietnam. It's their government. Also, critical, one thing that is left out of the comments about NATO expansion. At the end of World War II, there was a 4 powers agreement that said there were U.S. and Russia all had to agree before Germany could be allowed to unite. There were 4 zones. So that was at the end of World War II. At the end, as the Soviet Union was dissolving in 1991, our negotiators, Baker, asked Russia, we want to see a united Germany. So, but you have the power to stand in the way. They said, okay, we will not resist if the West wants East Germany to rejoin West Germany. But we ask one thing in exchange, that you would agree never to expand NATO eastward to be on our borders. Well, we made that promise, but like so many promises the American government has made, we reneged on that promise. And within 7 years after that agreement, we let 6 Eastern European countries come in, and after that, in 2004, now the total of 13 countries after we informed you we would not permit them to happen that are there. So can you imagine if there was a Russia expanding, saying to, say, the countries of North America, well, all you Central American countries, you've all been invaded by the United States, some of them many times, whether it's Nicaragua or Panama. So sign an agreement with us, and we'll protect you from future U.S. imperialist invasion. And we maybe don't cost too much. Then all of a sudden, well, let's have Mexico. Well, we've invaded Mexico several times. In fact, about a third of the western United States came from what was Mexico.
Land back!
So the point is, I think somewhere in the Bible, Jesus says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. So the sins of American imperialism, whether what we've done to Native Americans, what we continue to do to blacks and people of color, is a crime. So I truly believe that if we had honored our pledge and not expanded NATO, this invasion of Ukraine would not have happened. Does this mean that I'm in supporting or saying it's okay what Putin and no, not for sure. I'm just against war. And another factor of the modern world is not after World War I, most of the deaths and the injuries were combatants, soldiers on both sides. But in every war since then, the vast majority of deaths have come from innocent civilians. So it happened in Vietnam, it's happening in Ukraine now. And the hypocrisy of U.S. statements, oh, they've got this evil cluster bombs, just small little bomblets that dropped. We were using those in Vietnam when I was there 50 years ago. And those little bomblets are still killing and injuring Vietnamese today because what we think are landmines, they're not landmines, they're unexploded ordnance that's doing the damage today in Vietnam. Also, these fuel air bombs, for those of you who have familiar with that term, it's a two-type bomb and a huge several hundred gallons of fuel, jet fuel, are disseminated, and then a second later, the igniter goes off and blows this huge cloud of gasoline up. Very effective against hardened targets, like pillboxes, like caves. We use those fuel air bombs against Taliban in Afghanistan. And we're saying, well, that was okay, but now it's just totally evil for Russia to be using those fuel bombs against the Ukrainians. It's all insane. And for far too long, our country has been guilty of imperialist aggressive tactics against people throughout the world. So, one last thing. When I went to Cherkasy 3 years ago in 2019 to celebrate the 733rd anniversary of their city day. That's how old that city is. And I was hosted by a Rotary Club there. Provided my housing, my transportation, my interpreters. And so we started developing a sister club relationship with the Rotary Club here in Santa Rosa. So the head of that club there has set up a secure link, bank-to-bank transfer. So we are, so anyone that's looking for a secure way you can get your donation to really help people on the ground, where 100% of it is going to go to help Ukrainian citizens. This is a good way to do it. So I gave you the P.O. Box, but you just write a check to Santa Rosa East Rotary Foundation. It'll be a fully tax deductible, and you know that 100% of it is going to go to help the people. So thank you all for coming, and God bless, peace everywhere.
Hey, look, you got here late. Part of what's happening is the city failed to come through with the electricity. Now, brother has told us wind is picking up. We're not going to move the rally, but if you're having trouble hearing, try moving around. If there's somebody talking and you can't hear, try moving around. What we're doing is the best we can with what we have. And next, if she's still here, is we have Katrina from, just a second, yes?
I have a question.
Okay, you have a question, yes.
The Russians soldiers resist.
Yes, they can resist the same way. If I could have resisted against the lies I was part of in Vietnam, I would have been sent to Guantanamo prison. But I did not have the courage to do that. I think if you're part of the killing machine that's in a lot of military, it takes great courage to go against that. They could, but I could have done it also, and I could have gone to prison, and I did not. Yes.
Katrina, are you still, yeah, okay. We have Katrina from the Human Rights Commission, because when you're talking war and peace, you're talking human rights. Please come up. And this was by Katrina! Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. If you can't, just raise your hand and I'll try to project a little bit more.
Thank you.
My name is Katrina Phillips. I'm the chair of the Human Rights Commission.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mr. Katucha. He's the father of a really good friend of mine. When I was young, I'm an Army brat. My father is a Special Forces Green Beret airborne medic. We lived in Germany in the 80s, and it was under the threat of war constantly. We had bomb drills in the 80s, where the alarm would go off, get under our desks, like a desk was going to save us, and that was it. It was an everyday, booming warning of war. Now, when I moved from Germany, I moved to Indiana. Guess what? A tornado drill sounds just like a bomb drill sound. And on my first day of school, they had a tornado drill. Everybody got up, started walking out the door. I'm under my desk. I'm telling everybody, "You're gonna die!" I didn't make many friends. So one of my friends, later on in life, her name is Sama Al-Shabi. She is half Iraqi and half Palestinian. She's an artist. And the reason she became an artist is because she was born in Iraq. War happened. Her family left to Palestine. Then war broke out again in Palestine, and they knew they had to leave the Middle East. Her mother, in the linings of their jackets and clothes, sewed in all the family photographs They were only allowed to take one little bag because they had to act as if they were just going on a weekend vacation. And they escaped. They left everything behind. They have no idea what has ever happened to their home or their belongings. Last year, she won the Guggenheim Fellow for her photography. She does all the work about being Muslim, being Middle Eastern, being a woman, and how difficult that is. She often tells me about it, and how scared she was, and how scared her parents must have been, fleeing, on foot. I have some good news for you. There is a woman that I met about 8 years ago. Then I only knew her as Brianna Karjada. Now I find out she lives in Romania. Now I find out that her heritage and her royalty to her family has been returned. She's following in the footsteps of her grandmother, Ekaterina Karajda. She has opened up the headquarters, and yesterday they received 500 refugees in Bucharest. I have her information. I'm going to post it on the Human Rights Commission page on Facebook for donations. They've already received, within the last week, over 800 pounds of food, clothing, medicine. They're helping as many as they can. She made a deal with Uber so that refugees crossing, they don't have to pay to be brought to her. We can donate to Uber to help with those costs. They're also, with Uber, delivering donations and food and medicines. So there is a way for us to help. As a Human Rights Commissioner, I'm always looking for ways to help, boots on the ground. This is the great way, also with Mr. Bertucci's help. And I think that we all should give him another round of applause. Woo! All the work that he's done. Get down to bed, y'all. Get down to bed. So I'd like to leave you with a poem, if that's okay. This is called Chosen Battles. And so your words scatter like bones thrown across the floor, telling me my future in puzzles and whispers, a knuckle and a tear. I wish I could hear you better. I put my ear to the ground to listen for impending armies ready for triage. The endless swarm of tragedies, needing red blood cells, prosthetic legs, and plastic spleens. But there is only silence. Speak to me in words I can understand, and I will concentrate on learning your language. Somewhere in the middle of the desert, we can finally meet, our hearts, the common denominator. No pacts, no treaties. Let us solve this without the use of our skeletons. Our bones were never meant to be thrown. Thank you.
We have two speakers coming up, then of course you're invited to pick it, but also you've had opportunity to give material support to people in need that you can avail yourself of. Of our two speakers, the next one coming up is Elaine Holtz. She has 10 years of doing women's voice on KBBF, and she's going to speak now. And remember, if you can't hear, get closer. Are you going to use this?
No, you look fabulous, Elaine. I got it.
Okay, can you hear me now? No.
Gotta yell, Elaine.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. We're having a sound test. I know something, this is disgusting, that the city is not out here in full force turning on the system. And you should call everybody.
just talking with a young black man over there who's telling me about 400 years of oppression here in this country of black people. You know, and how can he join us protesting when we're we out there participating? So there's a lot of questions we have to answer. And the first question we have to answer in ourselves is what is it in the human species that we can go and bomb another country? What is it in the human species that we can have slavery? What happens when you have people of the Holocaust that are killing people in Palestine? What is it in our souls, in our psyches? And you know what I say? It's lack of self-esteem. That we do not believe that we are worthy to stand up and say no. But I want to practice something. I want to take an action. The first thing we need to do is appreciate each other. Look at the people that showed up. Appreciate. And you also have to have enough self-esteem to stand up to your friends and relatives who are saying this is a bunch of crap. You know, this is real. This is the first time in my generation that I actually heard of one human being alerting us on a possible nuclear reaction, and then government is saying we can't have a no-fly zone because they might pop up a nuclear weapon. What is it in our self, in our species, that we can do that? You know, I just had a very, can you hear me now? I just had a very interesting experience. My husband, Ken Norton, you know, I do women's spaces. I'm also the past president of NOW. And by the way, every woman in this community should be a NOW member. Yeah. You know why? Because when NOW shows up at a meeting, they've got 250,000 women behind them. That's power. That's power. That is power. If we don't join, if we don't support our local radios, our local community radios, and our local organizations, what's going to happen? Where are we going to be? There should be thousands of people out here right now, particularly women. You know, I have a poem I wrote. It's called I Am Women, I Am All Women. Since the beginning of time, life has come through my body, through my womb. I say no more killing of children. No more violation of children. Yes. So I want to just tell you about an interesting experience I just had. It was very, very heartbreaking. I went and saw hair. Okay? I've been an activist for probably 60 years, maybe 2 years old. I mean, I'm about to give up. I'm about to say, you know something, I can't do this anymore. Don't give up. I'm now doing it for the second time. And I say to myself, what is going on? And here I go and see hair. And at the last scene, when they bring the kid back in a casket, I broke into tears. I said, what the hell is going on? This is what we work for? This is what we went to the streets for? This is what women got rights for? That we could be in another war? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So I do the radio show Women's Spaces. It keeps me motivated. My goal is, you know, I can tell you all day long I'm fucked up in my language, but you know something, that does us no good. We have to all stand up and speak out. You know, I listen to these talk shows, I hear 90% men, the rest hardly any women. Where are the women? Why aren't they speaking out for the children, for the future? I don't understand that. You know, I wear pink because I honor Code Pink. How many people really know about Code Pink? How many people support it? I can't hear you.
Code Pink, who supports it?
Who supports Code Pink?
Good, that's good to know. Hey, these women have taken more chances than any one of us. I mean, I've seen Medea Benny that go into Congress and be thrown out and on her, you know, all kinds of different things. We need to support our organization. But back to Women's Spaces. My goal for Women's Spaces is to uplift women, to get them to have a louder voice, to get our self-esteem intact, to say that we have a right to speak. We have a right to be heard. How many of you have just sat in your living room and say, God, I'm so pissed off, I want to go do something? Well, write a letter to the editor. Call your congressperson. Go to a protest. Make a sign. You join the groups that are active, that are trying to do something. And support these organizations. Because they are more important today than ever. And you know, it's very discouraging when you get to be someone my age who's been protesting so long. You say, is it possible? Well, I believe in my deepest heart, I believe when the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, peace will prevail the earth. Well, that happened on December 2020. And one of the things that happened, when it happened, the rule and the idea behind it is, it's not going to be easy. When you go from Pisces, warlike, coming into Aquarius that you want peace, and you got all this weaponry behind you, it's going to take time. It's going to take energy. And remember, the first letter in peace is P, for patience, persistence, and power and possibility. The only way that peace is not possible is we believe it's not possible.
That's back.
So one of the things
That's what I say.
is kind of hokey. I do what is known as a business basis pledge. Maybe you got the card. Okay, I'm going to take your card out and do the pledge. We're going to make a commitment that our self-esteem is going to be so intact that we can write a letter to the editor. We can call our congressman and say, this is enough. How dare you support anything that even smells like war? Have you ever noticed when they go with the war budget, they just vote on it? Not a word, no debate, nothing. Just here's billions of dollars, blow up the friggin' world. When it comes to homelessness or Medicare, they're debating for 20 years. There's something wrong there. But the reason of what I believe is wrong is not enough of us have spoken out. We come out, we do this, we get together, listen to everybody, we go home, and we do nothing. And I'm not saying this group is true, but you have friends who do know that do nothing. Part of your assignment has to be that you have to talk to your friend and tell them they have to do something. But, sometimes you're a little shy because, you want to be liked. I want to be liked. I mean, I have more people that don't like me than like me.
No.
Okay, so I know so. Because of our activism. I'm not saying this group, there's a whole world out there.
Yep.
I mean, I remember during the anti-Lopez thing, I used to ask our supervisor, all we're saying is if this was your child, what would you expect your officers to do? And you know what they did? They spent in excess of $10 million to fight to make sure that this guy, Galhouse, was not, they went to the Supreme Court. Instead of saying, hey, a child was killed, no, they're going to prove that it was okay, they're going to justify it. So I want you to indulge something. God, something about the microphone. Well, this energy. Am I doing okay? Am I doing okay? With me? Yeah. And by the way, my husband, Ken Norton, is around somewhere. He's a co-producer. Oh, here he is. Raise your hand.
Hi.
Ken's the co-producer. And by the way, you don't think he's discouraged about the environment? He was one of the young people that paid money to get that car buried at San Jose State, which kicked off everything. And we're still struggling with the environment. Okay, so I want you to indulge with me before I get down. And then we're all going to do the self-esteem pledge together. I'm going to say it. You're going to repeat it after me. Are you ready? You're ready. 1, 2, 3. First I say it. Then you repeat it. Okay. Then we're going to all say it together. And I got to tell you something. If you don't say it loud enough, I'm going to make you do it over again. Okay?
Okay.
Out of time? I don't think so. Anyway, let's go. My self-esteem.
My self-esteem
Does not depend. On anything. Outside of me. My self-esteem. Depends. On my relationship. With myself. And my higher power. I believe, like the Native Americans, with my Creator. Look at this beautiful earth that they want to destroy. Now we're going to do it all together. Like I said, it was not loud enough. And I'm the judge on loudness, and I'm a little deaf. So I can hear it. So 1, 2, 3, let's go.
My self-esteem does not depend
on anything outside of myself.
My self-esteem depends on my relationship with myself and my higher power.
My Creator.
Support organizations like NOW. Support organizations like the Peace and Justice Center who put this on. Support women's spaces. I am one of maybe 5 women, total pure women's shows across the United States. And remember one thing, men and I am women. I am all women. Since the beginning of time, life has come through my. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you,
We're going to have our final speaker here, and then there's a sister with a brief announcement following. This is by the Peace and Justice Center, but it's also being co-sponsored by Code Pink. So our final speaker of our program, Karen Nunez, will speak here as soon as I figure out where she is. Oh, right behind me. Karen is going to speak next.
Everybody, can you hear me? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for staying. My name is Karen Nihus. I did found the North Bay chapter of Code Pink. I want to thank Elaine for bringing the pink today and also bringing the women's perspective. I don't know if you've noticed how women have been brought to bear by the U.S. officials as propaganda elements again on NPR. It's happening. They always use women to say we're promoting democracy. In this case, this was retrospectively justifying the United States overthrow of the elected Yanukovych government in 2014. They said, well, now there are more women in business. This is a business we're speaking. Now there were more women in government, so we must have freed them, but the numbers were pretty poor. Anyway, Code Pink's basic position on the Ukraine crisis is no to war and no to NATO. Okay? And you've heard about the problems with NATO from a number of the speakers here. Been in war, been to Russia. If you don't know much about the history of NATO, I can't blame you. We might say that Russia's shutting down its free press, but our press isn't very good at explaining stuff to us. I realize I'm wearing black and blue today, and I realize it kind of is symbolic about how I'm feeling about being a little beat up by our propaganda all these years. So, Elaine just talked about how her pledge is that our self-esteem doesn't depend on anybody else, right? Right. Well, when we think about ourselves as a nation, I have to ask, is our self-esteem a little bit dependent on somebody else, maybe an enemy? I think if you look at NATO, you might find a little bit of a history about that. And also if you look at the neocons who started Team B, which was a whole intelligence BS operation that led to the fake missile gap with Russia and us spending way too much money on war for decades. Anyway, the point is they believe in a philosophy that says we won't stay together as a nation, we can't stay behind the agenda, whatever it is, unless we have some other enemy, somebody out there. Now what happened? The Soviet Union fell apart, right? They ceased to exist in 1991. It was a crisis for the West because we lost our best enemy. They gave up communism. Oh no, what's the military complex going to do? Well, NATO still exists there. A few questions. Who knows which was formed first, NATO or the Warsaw Pact? That's right, NATO was formed first in 1949. 6 years later, the Warsaw Pact was formed to defend against NATO. What happened when Russia fell apart? What happened to the Warsaw Pact? Gone. There's no longer a hostile military alliance fighting NATO. It's just NATO surrounding Russia. We need to understand our role in this, to understand how we've gotten to this point. We need to understand, like Linda mentioned, how many initiatives the Russians have put in front of us. They tried all kinds of agreements after the U.S. reneged. The U.S. said we're not going to expand any further. 13 countries later. Meanwhile, they said, we'll join NATO. We'll be part of the solution. No, can't have that. We need an enemy, right? So we still have fear-mongering. We still have Russia as an enemy. What do they have to do? They gave up communism. They gave up all kinds of countries around the edges. I am not justifying this invasion. I am saying that we need to understand our role, right? Because if we were holding signs that say we want peace, how do you get peace? Well, first of all, you got to stop the conflict. Justice. 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 Those are the words that Lindsay opened our talk with today. Justice. What is justice in this circumstance? That means we have to understand both sides. Our job as Americans is not to focus on what's bad about Russia. Our job is to understand what our country has been doing, what our alliances have been doing in Europe and Eastern Europe. We need to get outside of our mainstream news sources. Even NPR has been bad. Did I mention that?
Yeah.
So I hope you have alternative news sources.
KPFA!
KPFA is great.
Amy Goodman.
Amy Goodman is great. I love what the people are shouting out.
KBBF.
KBBF is our local great.
Noam Chomsky.
Noam Chomsky. How many people have also seen... What?
Marin Post.
I don't know the Marin Post, but other
Civic
people...
Sun with Nikki Silverstein.
Okay, great.
Elaine Holtz.
Jack the Boho and Jack the Bohemian and the Pacific Sun.
There you go.
All right, so we've got some good local alternative coverage. I don't know, honestly, how much they're covering this conflict. How many people have seen the YouTube video that Oliver Stone made called Ukraine on Fire? Okay. You might not agree with it, but you really should check it out if you want to understand one perspective on what the United States has been doing and what NATO has been doing. Be careful, it's not the same as Winter on Fire, which is currently on Netflix. You have to look up Oliver Stone, Ukraine on Fire. Okay?
So does Russia want a Eastern Bloc?
So I just want to remind us of a few things we know. Question, which country has 800 bases in 150 of the world's 200? How many does Russia have in other countries? Anybody know? Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, okay? Which country spends over $500 billion a year on its military? United States. How much does Russia spend? About 1/10 of that, about 50 billion.
You know what I'm saying?
We talked about that. Which alliance has the so-called missile defense in Poland and Romania right up on Russia's borders? NATO, thank you. You know, did you know that even the guy who wrote the Western plans to encircle communist Russia and China in the 50s, George Kennedy, even he wrote in 1997, NATO, the worst thing they could do, the biggest mistake they could do would be to expand, because that's threatening Russia's vital interests. It's going to lead to a war, and look where we are. Kennedy. He wrote grand area plans that were kind of the risk plan for taking over the board. Because you know what? The West has a supremacy problem. We talked about white supremacy, not enough probably. Western supremacy is very similar. Europe, NATO, the North Atlantic, thinks it has the answer. It has the right to control resources. It has the right to control the world. Russia's supposed to become a vassal state and keep that status. But they have lots of oil and pipelines, so it's about that too. I think you all know that. But pipelines bring me to my last comment, which is we know that we have to be serious about understanding the other side's interest if we're going to actually negotiate a peace, right? It's our job to understand it, and it's our job to make sure that our representatives are negotiating in good faith. They have to give Russia something. So far, the West has refused to give Russia anything, including an agreement, a guarantee that Ukraine will stay out. To have peace, we obviously have to have net hostilities, but then you negotiate, right? So we have to make sure that we do not escalate. Because there are people in this country calling for the assassination of Putin. What else? What are people calling for on the right wing? Who's heard of it?
Lindsey Graham assassination.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham was the one who said assassination. So There are people who want to escalate this. We know that's a bad idea. For obvious reasons. Just heard on Democracy Now! That there's a nuclear sub in the Black Sea. Okay, so very dangerous. We don't want to escalate. We want to de-escalate, have negotiations to be legitimate. But we also have to do this because we have another battle we have to use our resources for, right? What is the biggest, most inevitable, most low-threatening crisis we are all in the middle of right now? The climate crisis, right? Russian permafrost is melting. They've had crazy fire, just like us, right? We need to stop this, right? So that we can take our time, our people power, our resources. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Thank you, Jim, if you're still here. And we need to put our time and our energy and our money. No to war, no to NATO. Yes, let's collaborate and solve the climate crisis. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So friends, that's the end of our program for today. But if you can hang for just a second more, we have a sister with a couple of announcements dealing with where she actually ended with fossil fuels. Thank you for coming. Robin?
Hi, I'm Robin, and I'm gathering signatures. There's other people here who've also been really supportive around this issue. The Jackson Demonstration Force, which is up in Mendocino County, CAL FIRE, our lovely firefighters who we want to love when they're saving our homes, want to make a lot of money for the state of California that we don't need by cutting down the second growth forest that is sacred land to the Pomos. So the sovereign nation of the Pomos, the chairman of the Pomos, Michael Hunter, has asked the 2nd District voters, and I think most of you, whether you live in the 2nd District now, you move next week, you might, can sign a petition. There's 3 petitions over there. Selena's holding up one there. We're gathering signatures to take to Mike McGuire, Jared Huffman, and Jim Woods, and to let them know we want them to support all efforts to save this forest, because this is the lungs of the planet. Sure, the forest needs to be managed. The undergrowth needs to be taken out so those woods don't go up in fire. But we need the oxygen, right? We all need, the planet needs to breathe. So next, March 14th, I believe that's Monday, there's a demonstration in Ukiah where we're going to give Mike Wire's office his share of the signatures. There's also a student global strike, and if any of you